Hi everyone, and this is the end, I believe, of week 5 of the course. We're moving shortly into week 6 of the course. Next week we'll be on the topic of science and spirituality, and as some of you are definitely aware, since we just did this course over the summer, there is an entire course on science and spirituality at Atlantic University, which I teach. So it's spending 1 week on the subject is definitely a shorter look at a very profound and sort of complex subject, really. But the reason for including it in a course like this on consciousness and the evolution of consciousness is, in a subject like that, there's an inevitable clash, and I would call it a clash of ways of knowing. And we've seen this already with starting out with science, then Wilbur, and then sort of Casey primarily, which the only way to entertain that range of ideas is to say, well, there's a range of ways of knowing. There's a range of ways of knowing about consciousness and its evolution. In order to get things that are so diverse in their perspective. And really, it's the contrast is between ways of knowing that essentially rely on evidence. I'm talking about concrete evidence, things that can be measured, basically, and ways that rely on knowing, sort of direct knowing, I would say. And so these two things are inevitably going to clash. And the side of science is the side of where we expect to have evidence, and such a way of knowing is almost always conceptual and abstract, right? So you have theories which involve abstract entities like electrons or things like that, and you make mathematical theories based on those and then run experiments to test them, basically. But ultimately the knowing is in a sort of mental abstract form, mathematical formulas which relate to entities that we don't directly encounter in general. None of us have ever really seen an electron, for example, nor could we. So it sort of works like that. The physical universe is reduced to a kind of an abstraction in scientific knowledge, and this is true to some extent of Wilbur as well. And then on the other hand, we have ways of knowing that we'd have to call them direct. I mean, Edgar Casey, where is that knowledge and knowing coming from? Well, it's really a direct contact with something, and there's a direct kind of knowing involved. And I believe many of you have experienced this, basically. But we don't legitimize that much in our culture, and so it suffers in comparison, I would say, which is a sort of a shame in a way, because it's a form of knowing that is not abstract, and therefore it has a very different kind of potential to the scientific knowing. And so this clash between ways of knowing that we encounter when we are in subjects like consciousness studies reveals or potentially reveals a kind of split, a kind of disagreement, if you like, between science and spirituality or science and religion. And the question is, can this split be overcome? Can we acquire a kind of unity of perspective? I want to suggest to you, since you're going to be asked this question next week, that you be willing to actually question the question. Is it actually a good question to ask about this, whether science and spirituality can be reconciled? Is that a good question? And I suggest that it might not be. So that there's a kind of there's a premise underlying that question that might not be valid, and so feel free to question the question as well as whatever answer you might give to it, because I'm not sure that it's the right question to ask even in this field. But nevertheless, we do notice that we get this sort of contrast, and often even if we are on the side of direct knowing, so the spirituality side of the equation, then even then we tend to try to justify that with scientific measurements, things that could be measured. So, for example, we look at brain scans of meditators to validate the use of meditation, for one example. Or we look for archaeological, historical information that doesn't agree with current mainstream archaeological views on the sort of history of humanity. And so we look for, we even if we're on the side of direct knowing, we will tend to look for validation into the concrete, into the physical. But science is explicitly designed to work with the material world, right? It's not designed to work with anything else. So science is particularly good at delving into the material world. But if you want to go beyond the material world, then science becomes not so useful. And you have to sort of switch over to other ways of knowing things. And at least this is my view. So science, by design and from its inception, is limited in that sense, and that should become clear in the Science and Spirituality course that we did over the summer. Won't become clear in this 1 week that we're looking at it, but so science basically, if you think there's more than the physical, more than matter and energy involved in this universe, then that more is something that explicitly can't be studied by science. It involves things that are not measurable, such as consciousness, for example, which is obviously not measurable, right? Even though it's definitely involved in the measurement, it's involved in the scientist, it itself cannot be measured. We can't we have no instrument that can look at the degree of consciousness or if the consciousness is present. We can't do that. So that the very sort of topic of consciousness and its evolution sort of almost requires you to move beyond that way of looking at things. Now, in this coming week, you have recordings from Ken Wilber on the subject of science and religion. And I hope you find those interesting. I personally definitely don't agree with everything Wilber says. I agree with maybe some of what Wilber says. And just so you know, I was a working scientist for most of my career in Earth and Space Sciences, and I have, a PhD in geophysics, and I, in my research work, was dealing with phenomena that required quantum theory. Basically, every day I worked with quantum theory and its consequences. So I'm familiar with much of the new physics, and much of the new physics has been used as potentially evidence for spirituality. Quantum theory does quantum theory provide evidence for spirituality? Or, as is talked about in the next week in the course notes, the Higgs boson, which some call the God particle, and does discovering that provide evidence for spirituality? And Ken Wilber will answer in the negative. And that is the area where I agree with Ken Wilber. The reason it was called the God particle is because scientists had to take its existence on faith for so long before they could actually prove that it existed before they had the Large Hadron Collider. So it's in fact, many of the scientists greatly regret that it got that name, the God particle. It's essentially just another particle required by the standard model of particle physics. Standard model of particle physics is what we think, what physics thinks this universe is essentially made of. So it includes the whole slew of particles that make up supposedly everything in our universe, right? And it required that there had to be a field and a particle that would give things this resistance to changing motion, and so, but it required two energies too high to prove it existed. That it didn't exist for many years until the Large Hadron Collider, and then they have at least potentially discovered that particle actually exists. So it's just another of the kind of ecology of particles that supposedly make up our universe. It doesn't really then take us to the domain of spirituality at all. It's simply part of this matter that everything is made of in our universe, and it doesn't take us to the non-physical, to the unmeasurable. It doesn't take us into that domain at all. And it's the same really with quantum theory. The only caveat to that, for me at least, is that if you go into quantum theory, then there's a way in which it starts to raise questions about things like space and time, and you start to realize that this world is made up of, this apparently physical world is made up of the non-physical, and so all it does, without actually taking us to spirituality, what it does is it raises questions about what reality is. And so, and that leads to a kind of opening of the mind, perhaps an opening of the heart, hopefully, that towards a kind of other views of the universe and our existence. And if nothing else, to a kind of deep mystery that the universe presents. So quantum theory is its contribution, I think, to spirituality. If one was to study it to some degree, it raises all of these questions about what reality is, and that is useful because it sort of walks you up to a kind of edge, and it doesn't go beyond that edge, but you, once you're at that edge, can step over it, and that would take you into the realm of mystery and spirituality, for example. But quantum physics itself doesn't go there. It proves nothing about spirituality, as far as I can tell. So its focus is the material world. All it does ultimately is call what we think about the material world into question. And so that in itself, of course, is interesting, but it doesn't take us into the realm of spirituality or religion. So, but these are just my opinions, okay? So, and Wilber has the same opinions or similar opinions about quantum theory, and can science be used to prove spirituality. But where Wilber does go, and this is where I don't agree with Wilber, he goes into he is firmly committed to an empirical way of knowing. So science, hopefully, is involved with empiricism, and empiricism meaning that you run experiments, and therefore the experiment is a kind of experience, and so you learn from experience how the world works. That combined with theories, abstract theories, so you put those two together, and that's how you build up scientific knowledge. So that's empiricism. Really means learning in a sort of rigorous way by experience. So one can learn, according to Wilber, from inner experience. We can run the experiment of meditating for 5 years and then report on the results and observe the results inside of oneself. And then one has learned empirically that that meditating for 5 years has these effects. And then you can compare notes with other people who've meditated for 5 years to see what effects it had on them. And that way you build up a kind of empirical knowledge of the contemplative path, the meditative path, for example. I have to say that I feel like this is utter rubbish. and so there you have it. I don't think that's the way it works at all with spirituality and meditation. I think there's a lot more intuitive and direct knowing involved in spirituality and in religion, actually, or at least true religion. And so I just don't agree that we're limited to empirical ways of knowing, as Wilber does. And what that does is it throws Wilber into this sort of camp where he's sort of committed to this one way of knowing, and we can never get there to what is truly the spiritual or religious kind of knowing. We can never truly get there. And so his whole model sort of comes across as a kind of extended material intellectual exercise, rather than actually going to something sublime, sacred, divine, that at all. It just doesn't go there. It can't go there. It's all reduced. It's reductive. It's reductionism, essentially. This is how I see it, anyway. So, so I don't think you can get there with the simple one way of knowing, one way of having reliable knowledge that Wilber puts forward. Although I do agree with some things he says on the subject. And then the question is, I suppose, and we have to ask ourselves the question of whether anything useful can be known about consciousness and its evolution via that means of knowing, via anything other than the direct means of knowing. Why we know that consciousness exists is that we have our subjective experience. We have our sense of ourselves, our inner experience. That's all we have, essentially, in terms of our knowledge of consciousness, really. Our knowledge of anything, actually. So, in terms of the measurable realm, it's a little bit like, potentially like going down a blind alley. And I'm making an argument here. It's just to sort of justify, I suppose, that we can actually go. We can make an argument, philosophical argument at least, for going to Casey and after next week to these things called the yugas, the cyclicity of changes in consciousness, that kind of thing. We can make an argument for that because consciousness can only be known from within, not from without. And therefore, the sort of direct ways of knowing, direct experience is maybe the only legitimate way of knowing what consciousness is and what it's doing. And we have to be careful because everything we see is seen through consciousness. So we can't know how much we can't know that consciousness. I can't know this pair of glasses without taking the pair of glasses off and looking at them. I can't know this pair of glasses because everything I see is seen through them, right? So it's a little bit like that. We're very limited in thinking about consciousness, and I think that we have to be open to other ways of knowing. Anyway, so this is the Science and Spirituality week. Anyway, and if you would take a course on consciousness studies at another college or school, a more conventional college or school, you get a heavy dose of science. You get a heavy dose of neuroscience, and you get a heavy dose of archaeology and history and that kind of thing. It would be much more focused on the measurable side of things, and I don't think that would take us that takes you into that. To me is kind of a blind alley. I mean, it can be interesting and fun, but it's not taking you to somewhere that actually is penetrating into truths about our existence. I don't feel like it is anyway, personally. So so that is Science and Spirituality. I just wanted to say that I thank you for all submitting your essays. Nobody has written saying they hate that means of submitting essays on via a kind of forum where others can read it. So I will probably go ahead and change next week's essay to that format. I do hope you've all read each other's essays. I really enjoyed reading your essays, and thanks for being so authentic and open in writing them. I appreciate it. And that's what made them so compelling, I think. And we'll be talking tomorrow, hopefully, or if I get this video out today, you'll have it. We'll be talking then on Sunday, hopefully, at 11 Eastern Standard Time, and there's plenty of topics for us to have interesting talks about. So I hope to see you. All right, everyone, and hope things are going well. Okay, bye.